Welcome to Bible Bits, Matthew chapter 5. A quick disclaimer, we are going to be splitting this into two parts because there's a lot. This probably won't be the only time we do this, but there's just too much material to cover with any sort of anything that it needs. We need two series. So this is part one. We're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 5, the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. It starts off, seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him. And the section we're going to focus on now is the Beatitudes, these statements about being blessed, and then salt and light, and Christ came to fulfill the law. I would call this kind of the introduction to the Sermon on the Mount, but the Sermon on the Mount is itself, an introduction. And what it's an introduction to is the best way to approach it is not to see it necessarily as an introduction to Jesus's teachings, but rather an introduction to ourselves. And that, what I mean is, this is about our identity, who we are. This is not simply, here's the set of rules you need to live by, but rather, who are you? And we can see that very clearly right at the beginning on purpose that Jesus uses the Beatitudes, because there are no instructions in the Beatitudes. There are rather statements or promises about being blessed. He says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. You might try to take those and say, what is it? How should I be poor in spirit? And there might be some instructions that we could do, but that's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, I shouldn't say you yet, because Jesus doesn't say you yet. He says, blessed are those. But that brings me to a point, since I brought it up, that there's a big shift happens in the Beatitudes, and it's perhaps was surprising to those whom Jesus called, and it might be surprising to us too, that he starts talking about who these blessed are those, and you might be left with a question, am I one of those? Am I on the inside or am I out? But it closes with, blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you and falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So it shifts from all these people who are blessed to kind of this key turning that you are. Who are we talking about? Well, we're talking about you, or we might say he's talking about us. So this is, there's a bit of a warning, you might say, or a heads up. Jesus is really starting to teach. He's done a lot of introductions up to this point, and we last week we talked a little bit about how he begins by saying, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And then he's done some healing. He's called some disciples, and now he's starting to lay things out in more detail. And there's all these descriptions that, again, if we remember, this is who we are, that we are poor in spirit. That's the first one. And to be poor in spirit, again, is not so much of attitude, although we certainly want to be humble, but it's more like that's who we are. We're just, when it comes to spirit, if you're poor in money, you don't have much. If you're poor in spirit, you don't have much. And so it's who we are. We don't have anything when it comes to spirituality. The right approach is not trying to be super spiritual, but rather say, the opposite of that cheer, or, I got spirit, how about you? We can say that as Christians now, but on our own, we don't got spirit, neither do you. We need Jesus, and so do you. That's the proper approach. It's not like, okay, I've got to be pious. That's something that a lot of people talk about now is being spiritual And whether they're talking about, Buddhism or even, Christianity, it could mean something that's kind of the opposite. It could assume that we have a lot of spirituality. I mean, I sort of get irritated that people think that about me because I'm a pastor. Like, oh, well, you're just one of those people. You're one of those people to whom spirituality matters. And I would say I would reject that kind of categorization of human beings as some people are spiritual and some people aren't. I would say I'm a poor miserable sinner. I'm not necessarily that inclined to be particularly pious or kind or to live the sort of way Jesus tells me I am to live and who I am. That's on my own. I don't think I have that much. And I think that's just the case, not just for me. I think we all lack in spirit. And Jesus, reminds us of that. But he says, but ours, nevertheless, even though we're poor in spirit, ours is the kingdom of heaven. It's grace, it's not because of our goodness. But nevertheless, we have the kingdom of heaven because of Christ. And it helps to remember that Jesus is not, when Jesus does this, what's the setting? He goes up on the mountain and he sat down and his disciples came to him. So he's not talking to the crowds in this case. And it's not to say that everyone who's there, it could be that some are more on the outskirts and maybe there's somebody who just came and that in. But really, Jesus is going out, and that's fits so much with what he's going to be saying, because he's going out, he's out in the wilderness, you might say. I mean, not that he's not like in Jerusalem anyway. He's in Galilee, and so he's already on the outskirts, but he goes further onto the outskirts. He goes up onto a mountain, and the people come out to him. So that's part of what it means to be a Christian, is to we got phrases about coming out of the closet, but for Christians, we come out of the world, and I mean, there's some similarities in, kind of that I think most Christians don't think about that. Maybe that's unfair. We may not always think about how we are outside of the world, that we're not just another, that we just happen to be Christian, versus being a Christian means I am someone different, as Jesus says in this section about being salt and being light. He says, you are the salt of the earth. And he says, and if the salt loses its saltiness, it's not good for anything. I mean, it's because it's like, how can salt be salt without being salty? It doesn't make any sense. And it certainly doesn't serve any purpose. And it's sort of the same. Jesus is saying, we as Christians, we are to be set apart from the world. You can't really be a Christian if you are just, homogenous with the world. You're different. It's part of who we are. Again, it helps to think of this as our identity. When we start to think about it as actions, there's a couple probably potential ways we could miss the mark, or we could set ourselves up for failure. One, when we look at it as principles or laws that Jesus gives, sort of generically, then we might get the sense that, well, we can take it or leave it. If these are laws Jesus gives, well, maybe I follow some and not others. Well, there's a little bit less wiggle room in a sense when he says this is just who you are. As a Christian, this is who you are. And again, to be salt, to be light, the same thing. He says, it doesn't make any sense to put a lamp under a bowl. You put it up high so people can see. You don't, except for like effect, you don't put lights on the floor. Usually you put the lights in this room or up on the ceiling, because then the light can shine more places. And you put a lamp on a stand so it spreads light. And we are a city on a hill. and we're not intended to be the same as everyone else. We're called to be set apart. Now, this is so consistent with how Yahweh has always been operating. He calls out Abraham, and he's to be very different from the nations, and he calls Israel to be different, to follow, to worship in a different way, to live in a different way, to act, and even in in the Old Testament, to eat and operate and be family in a different way than the world. So it's there's nothing new in a sense about this. This really is one of many ways in which Jesus is super consistent with what God has always been doing. And that, again, leads up to kind of nicely to the next point where Christ came to fulfill the law. Jesus says, don't think I haven't come to do away with the law. I haven't come to negate the law, but I have come to fulfill them. And then he says, for as truly I say, until heaven and earth pass away, not even the smallest part will pass away from the law until all is accomplished. And so therefore those who tell people don't sweat it is going to be called least in the kingdom of heaven, while those who teaches others to do the same will be called great in the kingdom of heaven, because we are to be of a different, greater kind of righteousness than that of the Pharisees. And we might say it's better to just think we are called to have a better righteousness than that of the world. And we really are called to be different and better. And Jesus says, look, I'm not getting rid of stuff, but rather I'm fulfilling it. And that's going to be really key in understanding, because Jesus is going to say some provocative things. And one of the more provocative is, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you, and we're going to talk more about that in the next episode. But what he's not saying that what God said before was a mistake. He's not saying I'm come to teach you something different. Rather, he's saying I've come to fulfill what has been said. And this is the way that Jesus is going to teach. He teaches with authority, it says later, and he comes from a different position than all the scribes, which is what was in Jesus' day for a lot of folks. There were certainly folks who were not Jewish, who were pagan, but for a lot of Jews, there was a lot of familiarity with the instructions that God gave to Moses, to the Torah, because if you remember, it's really helpful to remember this. In the Old Testament, the people of Israel are a different sort of entity than the church is today. They were literally called to be a holy nation. And I cringe when I hear people talking about being a holy nation today, like as if America is God's nation. That's not at all. Like, that's not who we are. America is a nation, but the church, throughout time and space and throughout every nation, is called to be the holy nation. And it's kind of like the Old Testament. The law, the Torah that was given was literally the laws, the Constitution that God's people, the Israelites, were supposed to live by. And it was legally binding to them. And Jesus is coming to do something to fulfill what God wanted. A law is given. Laws have limitations. And one of the limitations that laws have is they can really only control behavior, where that's their goal, is to control behavior. It doesn't really work. You can try, but it doesn't really work to make a law that you've got to be a certain way. You got to do more than just have laws to have something like that happen. But that's what Jesus is going to be aiming for, and Jesus says that God had something in mind when he gave these laws, and Jesus by saying, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you, because there's lots of people who did talk. In fact, that's what the Pharisees and the rabbis did. They talked about the law and tried to explain it. What does it mean? Like, what does the law mean? But Jesus is not, I would say that Jesus is not trying to explain what the law means. He's going further back. He's trying to explain what it is that God wants. He's trying to explain God's will, not just what this law meant, because that's what it means to fulfill. And in a sense, Jesus talks about fulfilling and not, he's not coming to abolish the law until heaven and earth pass away, not one iota, not a dot will pass away until all is accomplished. And the Torah in general, I think it's helpful to think of it as it's a covenant, and it's helpful to think of it almost like a mortgage. So when you take out a mortgage, eventually you hopefully you pay it off, and just because you pay the house off doesn't mean you've accomplished what you've wanted all along. Now you own the house. You've paid it off, but you no longer have to keep making those payments because now it's yours. And God, the old covenant, in a sense, is sort of like in some ways, like a mortgage. And the law was, once it is fulfilled, once you fulfilled the law, not that it was bad, but you just don't need it anymore because it's completed. And that's what Jesus has come to do. He has come to complete the law. And so the Torah, the Constitution, the covenant is no longer necessary. Now, of course, that doesn't mean, and this is very clear in the New Testament and throughout Jesus' teaching, that there's a way that we are called to live because it's who we are, after all. If this is who we are, then irregardless of if the covenant is fulfilled or not, this is simply who we are. But no longer do we feel the condemnation of the law, but we still are who God has made us to be and who He's called us to be. So that kind of sets the stage a little bit. It talks about being the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and Jesus will later redefine what greatness means. But he doesn't deny that that we should strive to be great. In fact, that's sort of insinuated that. But it's just that it's got to be very different than the Pharisees, and the way in which Jesus will continue to talk and preach on this Sermon on the Mount, we start to see what it is that he means that their righteousness is better than that of the Pharisees, because a lot of this stuff is going to be talking about how what God is most interested in is the heart. Jesus is not just looking for people to look good on the outside, which the Pharisees are really good at, and for that matter, we're really good at that. I mean, I think of on social media and videos and all kinds of ways in which we present ourselves, and we can edit things, and we want to look good. So we're just as concerned as ever with looking good and presenting something in a positive light. But Jesus is more concerned with being good than looking good. And that's the Pharisees' problem, though, is that they're looking at, and it's not a huge shocker because they're so focused on the law, but the law has limitations. And God gave his people the law, but what he really wanted was for their hearts to be changed. And again, Jesus really harps on that, but that is such a common refrain in the Old Testament too. And this is, again, nothing new. This is what God's always wanted. In Psalms, I think it says, the cattle on 1,000 hills are mine. If I needed food, do you think I'd have to ask you for it? That's not the point. God says the point of the sacrifice is not you feed me, I'm hungry, I need something from you. It's rather, a heart. And that's what, that psalm goes on to say, is that God wants a changed heart, not just externals. And that's what the Sermon on the Mount is going to really help us look at our hearts and the heart of humankind. So that's our conclusion for part 1, and hopefully you can join us for part 2 next time.